So, our debate is, does violent video games affect violence in children? And we have taken the side of against, saying that it has no effect, and we believe that it's not so much the violence that has an effect on children, it's more the subject matter of video games and the amount of time played on video games.
And more on that note, we believe that it's not that it may not even be video games themselves. A lot of times that cause violence in children. It's to a point. It's a lot of other things in school, like stress and anxiety and other issues we haven't addressed. That we shouldn't be merely poking at video games as the. Whoa.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, back to you guys for your opening statements.
So as previously stated, we're debating whether or not violent video games affect violence in children. We are on the side of it does. Multiple studies have proven the fact that it has affected kids. Although admittedly it might not be the only factor, it tends to be the most common factor seen.
About 9% of US kids ages 8 to 16 play video games, and they spend about 13 hours a week doing so. If you're bored, doing so more if you're bored. Now studies suggest virtual violence in these games may make kids more aggressive in real life. That's it. That's it.
Good.
Are we good to start with our 5 points?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah,
So,
go ahead.
do you want to start?
All right. Well, so first of all, from our perspective, there is no hard evidence that video games are the direct cause of violence. In fact, by statistics, over 90% of kids nowadays play video games. So it would be statistically more surprising that a kid doing a shooting in a school or something of that nature wouldn't be playing video games. And also on that fact, studies have shown that video games actually are a reducer of stress and anxiety and aggressive tendencies rather than a driving force in causing them.
Another point is that violence is in all media, not just in video games, and it can be harmless, as in, for example, the Looney Tunes. They use violence it's the base of their comedy, and it's meant for children. We think that it's not so much the violence, but the subject matter that we should be worried about children being exposed to. And also, in an Oxford University study, it suggested that kids who played for more extended periods of time per day were more likely to be affected, whereas children who would spend less time playing video games per day weren't as violent.
Okay.
That's it.
So, according to Time, in 2001 there was a study that showed after a week of violent video gaming, brain scans show less activity in regions connected to the emotions as compared to participants who played non-violent video games. The spiking stress hormones can rev up player sensitivity to slights or provocations. Playing violent video games can lead to longer-term suppression of empathy.
A study suggested violent video games cause an increase in aggression long after the game has been turned off, which draws this conclusion by linking a 20-minute game session with an aggression test 24 hours later, and differentiating between players who had thought about the game in this time and those who hadn't. Another one, an example is David Petrick, born August 24, 1991, is a convicted murderer from Wellington, Ohio, at the age of 16. Petrick shot both of his parents over a disagreement about his video games. His mother was killed and his father was badly injured. So just to play video games. Yeah, that's it.
Great, okay, so your 4 points are now down on both sides, so you have 1 minute break before your open debate.
So you said that, you mentioned an incident where someone shot his parents over video games. There's no saying that that could be caused by the video games or another problem within the family. For someone to shoot their own family, there has to be more problems than just frustration from video games or exposure to violence. In an American in an American Psychological Association study, they found that 90% of children in the United States play video games. And among kids between the ages of 12 to 17, that number rises to 97%. And more than 85% of video games on the market contain some form of violence. So in that case, we would have to assume that all kids are violent, which is certainly not the case.
And on that topic, in 2010, there was an experiment at the University of Sussex in England, and they had a bunch of kids play one of three games, either a pro-social game, an aggressive game, or a neutral game, such as Tetris or something. After 8 minutes, the experimenter accidentally knocks over a cup of pencils onto the floor. The participants who played the pro-social game were twice as likely to help them pick up the pencils than either of the two. So it's not necessarily the violence in the games that causes the drastic change in a tendencies of a person. It is whether or not they're trying to help in said video game, help another person out, play on a team, than it is for them to be killing a person rather than not killing a person in said game.
I have a study, I have an article from Time from Craig Anderson of the Study of Violence at the Iowa State University. He studied kids playing video games and came out with the ideas that kids were more hostile and violent after video gaming, and when asked, they had more fantasies about violence against others, although that did decline with age because they had found better outlets other than physical violence. There was an increase in aggressive behavior and violent tendencies the more hours they played.
But on that topic, it's, once again, the video games aren't as much of are more of an outlet than a teacher in a lot of cases. They're not being altered by the games in real life. A lot of kids from a very young age have a very good grasp of what is real and what isn't. So if a kid is thinking about said game, yes, his thoughts are going to be more violent in nature, but he's going to be that violence is being taken out of his violence against the real world and channeled into a video game.
I would like to counter that with the case of Adam Lanza, who shot 20 students and 6 staff in Connecticut. The Connecticut Senator, Christopher Murphy, stated, "I think there is a question as to whether he would have driven his mother's car in the first place if he didn't have access to weapons that he saw in video gaming that gave him a false sense of courage about what he could do that day."
Well, I would like to argue that he didn't get the idea from video games. Video games is not what introduced him to guns. I would say that obviously he's a very troubled person, and that's just one example of a child who plays video games out of the many children who, multitudes of them, play video games that are violent. Studies published in the journal Psychology of Popular Media Culture found that children who play online games involving linking up with other players were actually less likely to have problems relating to other children than those who played alone, sorry.
There's even a term to call people who aggressively act out, a rage quitter. So there's even rage gamers, just get mad for no reason, start cussing. In some cases they even get mad at their team,
No, that keep going. Or actually, never mind. It's the second language.
Okay, one.
I mean, if you guys are ready, then I guess we're ready. Okay. So just in closing, I'd like to say that it is unfair to use instances where a child who has committed acts of violence happens to have also been involved in video games. There is no real proof that that was a cause, or without neglecting any other aspects of the child's life, it's unfair to say and impossible to link that to his use of video games, as most children do play video games that are violent.
And even beyond that, even if it is the video game that was the trigger in a violent outbreak, is removing violence from video games really the answer? If it's not one trigger, it will be another. If not a movie with violence, or even a book or a comic book, one way or another, these kids will find the courage in something to do this violent act. And it would be more effective to instead focus our attention towards reducing anxiety and stress in schools, because we all know that kids in high school it's one of the most stressful times of their entire life.
Good.
Whatever you want.
I would like to bring up the fact that, according to ZME Science website, a review of 300 studies on violent video games and children's behavior concludes that violent video games present a risk factor in children that play violent video games. And although it may not be the main cause, it certainly does not help.
And nowadays it's easier for kids under 18 to get violent video games, even if the ESRB states that 17 plus can only play a mature game. And seeing death at a young age can nullify their senses to make them see death is okay. So killing someone could just be normal to them, seeing it at a young age in video games, movies, and even other media sources. And that's
Excellent debate. You guys